Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay. Picture this. A sailor stumbles off his ship after months at sea. His pockets are jingling with fresh wages, his stomach is growling, and his captain, feeling unusually generous, hands him a beautiful red herring for breakfast. As he's leaving the merchant's office, something catches his eye on the counter. It looks like a perfectly good onion bulb, just sitting there unattended. Well now, he thinks, that would go nicely with my fish. So he casually slips it into his pocket and strolls out. He finds himself a cozy spot on the docks, plops down on a coil of rope and digs into his meal. That onion tastes a bit odd, maybe a touch bitter, but he's hungry enough not to care. He has no idea he's just eaten the most expensive breakfast in the history of humanity. Meanwhile, back in the merchant's office, panic is spreading like wildfire. The merchant, a wealthy collector who takes enormous pride in his rare tulips, suddenly realizes his crown jewel is missing, his prized Semper Augustus bulb. Gone. This wasn't just any tulip. This single bulb was worth 3,000 florins. That's enough money to feed an entire ship's crew for a year, or buy a decent house in Amsterdam. The merchant and his staff tear the place apart searching. Finally, someone remembers the sailor. They burst into the street and spot him on the dock, contentedly swallowing the very last bite of his breakfast. The poor sailor ends up in prison for his innocent mistake, having consumed what might be the world's most expensive garnish. Now you might be asking yourself, how on earth could a flower bulb be worth more than a house? How could an entire nation lose its collective mind so completely that people would trade their homes, their land, everything they owned, for a single tulip? This is just one of the wild stories you'll find in a book written nearly 200 years ago, yet it reads like it could have been published yesterday. The book is called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, written in 1841 by a Scottish journalist named Charles Mackay. But don't let the word journalist fool you into thinking this is some dry historical text. This is a mirror held up to humanity's face, showing us a fundamental truth about ourselves that's both fascinating and terrifying. While we love to think of ourselves as rational individuals making smart decisions, when we get together in a crowd, we can become spectacularly, catastrophically, and sometimes hilariously insane. Mackay witnessed this pattern playing out again and again throughout history, in financial bubbles where fortunes evaporated overnight, in witch hunts where entire communities descended into paranoid terror, in crusades that sent millions on journeys of faith that ended in bloodshed. He understood a secret about human nature that most people never quite grasp. And by the end of our time together, you'll understand it too. You'll start seeing these same forces at work right now, today, in everything from stock market crashes to viral social media trends. This isn't just a trip down memory lane. It's a survival guide for navigating a world that occasionally goes a little bit crazy. And trust me, knowing what Mackay knew might just save you from making some very expensive mistakes. So, shall we begin? Have you ever noticed how easy it is to do something foolish when everyone around you is doing it? Why a terrible joke suddenly becomes hilarious when the whole room erupts in laughter? Or why an obviously risky idea seems perfectly sensible when everyone's nodding in agreement? Charles Mackay would tell you the answer lies in one of the most powerful forces on earth, the madness of crowds. Mackay's great insight, the thread running through his entire work, is surprisingly simple yet profound. He wrote, "Men, it has been well said, think in herds. It will be seen that they go mad in herds, while they only recover their senses slowly and one by one." Think about that for a moment. Madness is a group activity. Sanity is a solo journey. This simple idea is the key to understanding some of the most bizarre and destructive events in human history. And there's no better place to see this madness in full bloom than in the world of money. Our story begins in the early 1700s with a man who was either a genius or a madman, or quite possibly both. His name was John Law. Born in Scotland, Law was brilliant, handsome, and absolutely gifted with numbers. He was also a gambler and a duelist. After killing a man in a duel in London, he had to flee to Europe as a fugitive. But his restless mind couldn't stop working on an audacious idea. Law believed that money wasn't really about gold and silver coins. True money, he argued, was credit, belief, a promise. He thought a nation's wealth wasn't limited by how much physical gold it possessed, but by the confidence of its people. If a government could issue paper money backed not just by gold but by the value of all the land in the kingdom, it could create unlimited prosperity. For years he pitched this revolutionary idea to kings and princes across Europe. They all dismissed him as a dreamer, that is, until he arrived in France. In 1715, France was teetering on the edge of collapse. The long, extravagant reign of King Louis XIV had buried the country in debt. The treasury was empty. Trade had ground to a halt, and the people were miserable. The new ruler, the Duke of Orleans, loved pleasure more than policy, and was desperate for a quick fix. Enter John Law. Law was charming and confident, and his vision was absolutely intoxicating. He didn't just promise to solve France's debt problem, he promised to make every citizen rich. The Duke, desperate and intrigued, decided to give him a shot. In 1716, Law opened a private bank and began issuing paper notes. Unlike the government's devalued coins, he promised to redeem his notes in gold or silver any time, no questions asked. It was brilliant. For the first time in years, people had a currency they could actually trust. Commerce began flowing again. Law's notes became worth more than actual coins. He was hailed as a savior. But this was just the warm-up act. Law's real ambition was far grander. He established the Mississippi Company, which received exclusive trading rights to the vast, unexplored territories of French Louisiana in North America. The stories that began circulating about this land were absolutely fantastical. It was described as a new Garden of Eden, overflowing with gold, silver, and precious gems. Mountains of gold just waiting to be scooped up by anyone brave enough to venture there. Of course, it was complete fantasy. Louisiana was mostly swampland, but the story was too delicious not to believe. Law's company started selling shares, and the people of France went absolutely wild. The promise of unimaginable wealth, combined with the early success of Law's bank, created a perfect storm of public frenzy. The street where the company's office was located, Rue de Quincampoix, became ground zero for financial mania on a scale the world had never witnessed. From dawn till dusk, this narrow street was packed with a frantic mob representing every level of society. Dukes and duchesses stood elbow to elbow with cooks and cobblers, all desperate to buy shares. The stock price didn't just rise by the day or even by the hour, it rocketed upward by the minute. A share purchased in the morning for 500 livres could be sold that same afternoon for 5,000. Fortunes materialized out of thin air. A humble servant could wake up poor and go to bed a millionaire. The absurdity reached truly incredible heights. A cobbler with a small stall on Rue de Quincampoix made a fortune simply by renting out his workspace to brokers who needed a surface to write their contracts. Mackay tells the story of a hunchbacked man who earned serious money by lending out his hump as a writing desk for the frantic speculators crowding the street. The madness consumed everyone. People sold their homes, their family estates, their jewelry, anything they could convert to cash to buy more shares. The demand was so insane that Law had to create hundreds of thousands of new shares, which were snapped up the instant they were offered. 300,000 applications poured in for just 50,000 available shares. John Law became the most powerful man in France practically overnight. Princes and bishops waited for hours in his antechamber, begging for the privilege of getting on his subscriber list. One desperate lady ordered her coachman to deliberately crash her carriage right as Law was passing by, just so he would rush to her aid. When he did, she confessed her trick. He smiled and granted her the share she wanted. For a brief, shining moment, Law's dream of universal prosperity seemed to have come true. Everyone was rich, at least on paper. A new word, millionaire, was coined to describe this new class of wealthy speculators. Luxury and extravagance were everywhere. But it was all built on quicksand. The whole thing was a bubble, glittering and beautiful but completely hollow. The problem was brutally simple. The value of the shares was based on pure fantasy, the imaginary gold mines of Mississippi. To keep the frenzy going, Law's bank had to print more and more paper money to meet the endless demand for shares. Soon, there was far more paper money floating around than all the gold and silver in France combined. A few shrewd investors began to suspect this couldn't last forever. They quietly started selling their shares, converting their paper profits into real gold and silver, and smuggling it out of the country. One clever speculator, named Vermeulet, gathered nearly 1,000,000 livres in gold and silver coins, hid them in a farmer's cart under a pile of hay and manure, disguised himself as a peasant, and drove his fortune safely across the border into Belgium. As more people tried to cash out, the scarcity of real coin became painfully obvious. Panic set in like a fever. People rushed to Law's bank, demanding gold for their paper notes. The bank, of course, couldn't pay. The bubble didn't slowly deflate. It exploded. The stock price collapsed as spectacularly as it had risen. Yesterday's millionaires became today's beggars. The man who'd thought himself a lord one week was penniless the next, clutching nothing but worthless pieces of paper. The public, who had recently worshipped John Law as a god, now cursed him as a demon. His carriage was mobbed in the streets. He had to flee France in disguise, ending his days as a poor, hunted man. France was left in ruins, its economy shattered, and its people bitterly disillusioned. The great Mississippi scheme was over. You'd think that after witnessing such a spectacular disaster, other nations would learn their lesson, right? But as Mackay shows us, the madness of crowds is incredibly contagious. Even as the French frenzy was collapsing, a new one was brewing across the English Channel. This was the era of the South Sea Bubble. The story is eerily similar. The South Sea Company was founded in 1711, with a plan to take on England's national debt in exchange for exclusive trading rights to Spanish colonies in South America. Just like the Mississippi scheme, fantastical stories circulated about the boundless wealth of these lands. Peru and Mexico, people whispered, were bursting with gold and silver mines, and the locals were supposedly eager to trade their precious metals for English cloth. For a few years, the company's stock was a quiet success, but when its directors saw the mania John Law had created in France, they were inspired. They thought they could replicate it in England, but do it better, avoid his mistakes, and stretch the bubble even further. In 1720, they unveiled their grand plan to Parliament. The public was immediately captivated. The company's stock, which had been trading around £130, shot up to 300, then 400. The wildest rumors made the rounds. There was talk of secret treaties with Spain that would open all of South America to English trade. Silver would become as common as iron. Exchange Alley, the heart of London's financial world, became completely impassable. Everyone from the highest lords to the lowliest servants was buying stock. As Mackay puts it with his characteristic wit, every fool aspired to be a knave. The South Sea Mania spawned hundreds of other, even more ridiculous ventures. These were called bubbles, and boy was that the perfect name. A company was started for a wheel for perpetual motion. Another proposed importing walnut trees from Virginia. One was founded to make deal boards out of sawdust. But the most famous, and perhaps the most shameless, was a company launched by an unknown adventurer. The prospectus was a masterpiece of pure audacity. It was for a company for carrying on an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. Just read that again. The promoter was literally asking for £500,000 for a venture he refused to describe. Each subscriber had to pay just £2 per share as a deposit, and in return he promised annual profits of £100 per share. Sounds completely insane, right? The next morning, when he opened his office, a crowd rushed in. In just 5 hours, he sold 1,000 shares, pocketing £2,000. That afternoon, he closed his office, left London, and was never heard from again. Brilliant. Meanwhile, South Sea stock continued its dizzying climb, reaching a peak of over £1,000 per share. The whole nation seemed to have lost its mind. But just like in France, the bubble was doomed. People began realizing the company's profits were imaginary. The stock began falling. Panic spread like wildfire. Within weeks, the stock had crashed, wiping out fortunes and leaving thousands of families in ruin. The stories of the Mississippi Scheme and the South Sea Bubble are more than just entertaining historical curiosities. They're powerful warnings. They show how a compelling story, mixed with the promise of easy wealth, can completely short-circuit our reason. They teach us that when everyone around you seems to be getting rich quick, that's precisely when you should be most cautious. Mackay writes that people would eventually, quote, start up, as from a dream, and ask themselves if these things could have been true. The dream of easy money is always tempting, but the waking up is always brutal. But what if the delusion isn't about money? What if it's about something far more primal, like faith or glory? Mackay shows that the same crowd madness can take hold, but with even more devastating consequences. For that, we turn to one of the most extraordinary episodes in human history, the Crusades. For 200 years, Europeans had been making pilgrimages to Jerusalem to visit the holy sites of their faith. At first, it was peaceful. But in the 11th century, the Holy Land was conquered by the Seljuk Turks, fierce warriors who began persecuting Christian pilgrims. Tales of their suffering spread across Europe like wildfire. Then a man appeared who would channel this simmering outrage into an inferno. His name was Peter the Hermit. He was a small, unassuming monk, but he possessed fiery eloquence and unshakable conviction. He'd made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem himself and witnessed the cruelty firsthand. When he returned, he began preaching to the people, his voice ringing with passion and fury. He told them of desecrated holy places, of pilgrims robbed and murdered, and he called on all of Christendom to rise up and reclaim Christ's tomb from the infidels. His words struck a deep chord. The people of Europe were ready for his message. They were deeply faithful, but also largely ignorant and superstitious. They were also violent. The nobles lived for war, and the common folk were crushed under feudal oppression. Peter's call offered something for everyone. For the pious, it was a holy mission. For sinners, it promised instant forgiveness for all past crimes. For nobles, it meant glory and conquest. For the poor and downtrodden, it was an escape from misery. Pope Urban II saw the power of this movement and gave it his blessing. At a great council in Clermont, France, he delivered a speech that set Europe ablaze. He spoke of sacred land flowing with milk and honey, now defiled by a wicked race. He promised eternal rewards in heaven and rich lands on earth to all who would take up the cross. As he spoke, the vast crowd was swept away by pure emotion. They began shouting, as if with one voice, Dieu le veut, Dieu le veut. God wills it, God wills it. This became the battle cry of the Crusades. What followed was a spectacle of human devotion and folly on a scale never seen before. It wasn't just an army that gathered, it was a migration of entire populations. Hundreds of thousands of men, women, and even children, from every corner of Europe, abandoned their homes and began the long, perilous journey to the east. Mackay describes it vividly. The farmer endeavored to sell his plow and the artisan his tools, to purchase a sword for the deliverance of Jerusalem. So many people were selling their property that land and houses could be bought for a fraction of their value. The first wave, led by Peter the Hermit himself, was little more than a disorganized mob. They were poor, undisciplined, and utterly unprepared. They had no supplies and believed God would provide for them. As they marched through Eastern Europe, they plundered the countryside, leaving destruction in their wake. They were slaughtered by the thousands, by the angry people whose lands they ravaged. By the time the miserable remnant reached Asia, they were easily destroyed by the Turks. But this was only the beginning. Behind them came the real armies of the Crusade, led by great feudal lords like Godfrey of Bouillon and Raymond of Toulouse. These were armies of trained knights, the finest warriors of the age, but they too were driven by the same volatile mix of faith, ambition, and greed. Their long, brutal march, the siege of Antioch, and the final bloody capture of Jerusalem is an epic of courage, cruelty, and fanaticism. When they finally took the Holy City in 1099, they unleashed a massacre so terrible that the streets were said to have run with blood. They'd come to reclaim the tomb of the Prince of Peace, and they did it with savagery that would have horrified him. The Crusades show us what happens when an entire continent is gripped by a single idea. It wasn't just a war, it was a mass delusion lasting nearly 200 years, costing millions of lives, and ultimately achieving almost nothing. The Christian kingdom they established was weak and short-lived, but the Crusades changed Europe forever. They broke the power of feudal lords, increased the power of kings, opened new channels of trade and knowledge with the East, and perhaps most importantly, demonstrated the terrifying power of a crowd united by a single, all-consuming belief. But what happens when that belief isn't about reclaiming a holy city but about an enemy supposedly living right next door? Mackay shows us the madness can turn even darker. For this, we enter the shadow world of the Great Witch Mania. For centuries, belief in witches and sorcerers had been part of folk superstition, the stuff of village gossip and fireside tales. But in the 15th century, something changed. The fear, which had always been simmering, began boiling over. Europe was entering a period of great upheaval, religious, political, and social. In times of uncertainty and anxiety, people look for someone to blame. The witch became the perfect scapegoat. The Church, seeking to consolidate power and stamp out heresy, began taking the threat of witchcraft seriously. In 1488, Pope Innocent VIII issued a papal bull, a formal declaration that unleashed a storm of persecution. He appointed inquisitors to hunt down and punish witches and declared that anyone denying the existence of witchcraft was a heretic. This was the spark that lit the fire. A class of professional witch hunters arose. One of them, a German inquisitor named Sprenger, wrote a book that became the witch hunter's Bible, the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of Witches. It laid out in terrifying detail how to identify, prosecute, and punish a witch. The madness spread like plague. In Germany, France, Switzerland, and eventually England and Scotland, an epidemic of terror seized the people. Every misfortune, a storm that ruined crops, a cow that stopped giving milk, a sudden illness, a child's death, was blamed on witchcraft. The accused were almost always the most vulnerable: poor, elderly women, especially those who were eccentric, ill-tempered, or isolated. To be accused was essentially to be condemned. The proofs were absolutely insane. There was the witch's mark, supposedly a spot on the body, insensitive to pain. Professional witch prickers traveled from town to town with long pins, jabbing the accused all over their bodies. If they found a spot where she didn't flinch, perhaps due to a callus or simple nerve damage, it was taken as sure proof of guilt. Another infamous test was swimming. The accused would have her hands and feet tied together and be thrown into a pond. If she sank and drowned, she was declared innocent. If she floated, it proved the pure element of water had rejected her, and she was guilty. Either way, she died. The trials were complete mockeries of justice. Torture was used routinely to extract confessions. Victims, in the agony of the rack, would confess to anything: flying through the air on broomsticks, dancing with the devil, causing storms and plagues. And they were always forced to name accomplices. The circle of accusation widened endlessly. drawing in more and more innocent people. In Scotland, under King James VI, a man so obsessed with the subject he wrote his own book on demonology. The persecution was particularly savage. In the town of North Berwick, a group was accused of raising a storm to sink the king's ship. The confessions, extracted under torture, were wild fantasies of meeting the devil in a church at night, sailing the seas in sieves, and using black magic to brew tempests. Dozens were burned at the stake based on these ravings. In England, during the chaos of the Civil War, a man named Matthew Hopkins appointed himself Witchfinder General. For a fee of 20 shillings per town, he'd travel the countryside discovering witches with his pricking needle and swimming test. In just 1 year, he was responsible for 60 deaths. The scale of this madness is hard to comprehend. For over 2.5 centuries, thousands upon thousands of people, some estimates reach 40,000, were executed for witchcraft. It was mass delusion, fueled by fear, superstition, and religious fervor. Mackay shows us that when a crowd finds an enemy to hate, its capacity for cruelty knows no bounds. The financial bubbles show us the madness of greed. The crusades show us the madness of faith. The witch hunts show us the madness of fear. But what about the madness of hope? The hope for secret knowledge that could conquer the limitations of human existence? This brings us to the strange and fascinating world of the alchemists. For more than 1,000 years, some of the brightest minds in the world were captivated by a single, seductive dream, the search for the philosopher's stone. This wasn't just any stone. It was a legendary substance said to have 2 incredible powers. First, it could transmute base metals like lead or iron into pure gold. Second, it could create an elixir of life, a potion that would cure all diseases and grant immortality, or at least an incredibly long life. It was the ultimate shortcut. Why toil for wealth when you could create it? Why suffer from sickness and old age when you could be forever young and healthy? The search for this stone, known as alchemy, consumed thousands of lives. It was a strange mix of early science, mysticism, and outright fraud. The alchemists were a curious breed. Some were genuine scholars, driven by thirst for knowledge. They were the early chemists, and in their quest for the impossible, they made many real and valuable discoveries. They learned about acids, alloys, and distillation. The great Roger Bacon, a brilliant 13th-century monk and scientist, was a devoted alchemist. But his experiments also led him to discover things like gunpowder and the principles behind eyeglasses and telescopes. But for every genuine seeker, there were 100 charlatans preying on the greed and hope of others. They'd travel from court to court, promising to make gold for some wealthy duke or prince. They'd set up impressive laboratories filled with strange vessels and smoking furnaces, performing elaborate, mysterious rituals. They'd speak in confusing jargon of calcination, sublimation, and projection, designed to impress their patrons. And of course, they always needed more money for expensive materials. The tricks were often simple but effective. One common method used a crucible with a false bottom. They'd hide real gold in the secret compartment, then ceremoniously melt lead in the crucible. When the lead was poured out, gold would be discovered at the bottom. The alchemist would declare the projection a success, but claim his supply of magic powder of transmutation was exhausted. He'd collect his reward and quickly leave town before his victim discovered the trick. But the most fascinating part isn't the fraud, it's the genuine belief. Mackay tells the story of Bernard of Treves, who devoted his entire life to the search. He began at 14 and continued without success until he was 85. He spent his entire family fortune traveling across Europe and the Middle East, consulting with every alchemist he could find. He tried every recipe, every process, every bizarre ingredient, from eggshells to human waste. He destroyed his health, his wealth, and his life, all in the grip of this one powerful delusion. At the very end, a poor and broken old man, he wrote that he'd finally made a great discovery. The true secret wasn't turning lead into gold, but finding contentment with what you have. A lesson learned a lifetime too late. The dream of alchemy shows us another side of crowd madness, the madness of wishful thinking. The belief that there's a secret key, a magic formula that can solve all our problems. It's a delusion still with us today in 1,000 different forms. The great manias, financial bubbles, witch hunts, are easy to see in history's rear-view mirror. They're so extreme, so irrational, we can comfortably distance ourselves. We would never be so foolish, we tell ourselves. But Mackay's final lesson is perhaps the most unsettling. The same psychological forces are at work in our everyday lives, in much smaller, subtler ways. He calls them popular follies. These are the fads, catchphrases, and strange fashions that sweep through a city or nation, then disappear as quickly as they came. In Mackay's London, a popular slang phrase would suddenly be on everyone's lips. For a few months, the word quos was the universal answer to everything, a way of expressing disbelief, teasing a friend, ending an argument. It was chalked on walls, shouted in streets, and then suddenly gone, replaced by the next fashionable phrase like, "What a shocking bad hat." These follies are harmless, of course, but they come from the same place as more dangerous delusions. They come from our deep human need to belong, to imitate, to be part of the herd. They show how easily an idea, even a silly one, can spread and take hold of the collective mind. Whether it's a financial bubble, a witch hunt, the search for a magical stone, or a silly catchphrase, the pattern is the same. An idea emerges, captures the imagination, spreads through imitation, and grows into a powerful, often irrational force. We're social creatures, and our desire to conform is one of our most powerful instincts. That's Mackay's timeless and vital warning. The madness of crowds isn't something that happened to other people in other times. It's part of our shared human nature. It's a fire always smoldering, waiting for the right conditions to burst into flame. So, what are we supposed to make of all this? A book crammed with tales of financial ruin, religious fanaticism, and bizarre superstitions from centuries ago. You might be tempted to read these stories and think, wow, people were really foolish back then. We're so much smarter now. But that, my friend, would be the most dangerous delusion of all. The true genius of Charles Mackay's book is that it's not really about the past. It's about right now. The technology changes, the fashions change, the names of the delusions change, but the underlying human psychology, it stays exactly the same. Think about the financial bubbles Mackay described, the Mississippi scheme, the South Sea bubble, the Tulip Mania. Are they really so different from the dot-com bubble of the late 90s, when people invested their life savings in internet companies with no profits and no actual business plan? Are they so different from the cryptocurrency manias we've witnessed, where digital coins with no intrinsic value soared to unimaginable heights, fueled by hype and the fear of missing out? The story is always the same. A new, exciting opportunity appears. An intoxicating narrative of endless wealth takes hold. Everyone you know is getting rich. The fear of being left behind becomes stronger than the fear of losing money. Greed overwhelms reason, and people, smart, educated people, throw their money at things they don't understand, convinced that this time it's different. But it's never different. Because the crowd is driven by emotion, not logic. And what about the other delusions? The witch hunts, where fear and paranoia turned neighbors against each other. Don't we see echoes of that in the political polarization of our own time? When we stop seeing people with different views as fellow citizens to debate with, and start seeing them as evil enemies to destroy. When we become so certain of our own righteousness that we're willing to ruin the lives and reputations of those who disagree? That's the spirit of the witch hunt, alive and well in the 21st century. The alchemists and their search for a magic solution to all life's problems. Don't we see that same desire for a quick fix in our culture of fad diets, get-rich-quick schemes, and self-help gurus promising to transform your life with one simple secret? The power of these popular delusions lies in their ability to bypass our critical thinking. They appeal directly to our deepest hopes and fears, our desire for wealth, our need for certainty, our fear of the unknown, our longing to belong. And in the age of social media, these delusions can spread faster and wider than ever before. An idea, a rumor, a piece of misinformation can circle the globe in an instant, amplified by algorithms designed to feed us more of what we already believe. So how do we protect ourselves? How do we keep our sanity when the world around us seems to be losing its mind? Mackay's book offers us a clue. Remember his great insight. People go mad in herds, but they recover their senses slowly and one by one. The answer, then, is to cultivate the habit of independent thought. To learn to step back from the crowd, to question the prevailing narrative, to resist the pull of popular emotion. Here are 3 simple practices that can help you do exactly that. First, practice healthy skepticism. When you hear about a new investment that can't fail, a new political movement with all the answers, or a new trend everyone's following, take a breath. Ask questions. Who benefits from this idea? What's the evidence? What's the counter-argument? The crowd hates nuance. Your job is to seek it out. Second, understand your own emotions. Recognize the pull of greed, the sting of fear, the comfort of belonging. These are powerful forces that can cloud your judgment. When you feel a strong emotional reaction to an idea, especially one shared by a large group, that's your signal to be extra cautious. Don't let your feelings make your decisions for you. And third, learn to be comfortable being in the minority. The path of independent thought is often lonely. It can mean disagreeing with your friends, your family, or your community. It can mean being called a fool, or worse. But it's the only path to true clarity and wisdom. The greatest thinkers and leaders in history weren't the ones who followed the crowd. They were the ones who dared to stand apart from it. Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds is more than a collection of fascinating stories. It's a timeless lesson in human psychology. It teaches us that our greatest vulnerability isn't our ignorance, but our desire to believe. And it reminds us that the most important, and often the most difficult task we have, is to think for ourselves. That was our deep dive into Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay. We've explored some of the most powerful stories and ideas from this incredible book, but I'll be honest with you, a summary is like looking at a map of a beautiful country. It can show you the landmarks, but it can't give you the feeling of walking those ancient streets or breathing that fresh mountain air. The real magic happens when you read the book yourself. It's in those quiet moments when a particular story or simple phrase connects with you in a way you didn't expect. This summary is a starting point, a guide to help you decide if this book is worth your time. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity or made you think differently, I truly encourage you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning facts from the past. It's an experience that can genuinely change how you see the world and your place in it today. You can find a link to the book in the description below. And if you found this journey valuable, I'd be so grateful if you'd hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know we're on the right track and ensures you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book from the Billionaire's Bookshelf. Let's keep growing together.